My brother said, "We are blood, so half your business is mine." After vanishing for 6 years and showing up with a lawyer to take what I built, so I replied, "Blood does not turn abandonment into ownership." The first time I saw my brother in 6 years, he was standing in my office with a lawyer, a stack of papers, and the same lazy confidence he used to wear when he knew somebody else would clean up his mess. He had come back to demand half of the restoration shop I had built from a collapsing garage and a pile of debt. My mother was already acting like I should make it easy. That was how I knew this was going to get ugly. I was 31 then, and the shop was finally steady enough that I could breathe without checking the bank app every hour. I had spent almost a decade making it that way. When my brother, Caleb, disappeared, the garage was still mostly a family salvage yard with one service bay that smelled like old oil and wet cardboard. Now it was a custom restoration business with 3 bays, a paint room, 2 employees, a waiting list, and enough local reputation that people drove in from other counties. I did not feel rich. I felt tired. I felt proud in a quiet way that I had never really gotten to say out loud. And then Caleb showed up like none of that existed. He was thinner than I remembered, but not in a healthy way. His face had gotten sharper. His hair was trimmed. He wore a jacket that looked expensive at a glance and cheap the second you looked twice. He had the kind of smile people use when they want to look harmless while they are reaching for your wallet. The lawyer beside him was already scanning my office like he expected to find weak points in the walls. My mother stood behind them, clutching her purse, looking like she had been crying before she came in. I remember staring at all 3 of them and feeling something in me go cold. Because my brother had not called, he had not written, he had not answered any of the family searches, the police checks, or the endless questions about where he went after he took Dad's tools, the cash drawer money, and the last of my savings account. He had just vanished. And now he was back, not with shame, not with an apology, but with paperwork. The worst part was that this did not even feel surprising. It felt like the next ugly chapter in a story I had been trying to escape for years. When Caleb and I were kids, everyone said he was the future of the shop. He was the older son, the charming one, the one who could talk to customers while Dad bent over an engine. He learned enough to sound impressive and just enough to get praised for trying. I was the one who actually listened. I was the one who stayed late and swept the floors and sorted bolts by size because Dad said that was how you learned the business. Nobody called me the future. I was the backup. That was fine when we were teenagers. It stopped being fine when we were adults and the whole family still acted like Caleb's potential mattered more than my work. He had been drifting for years before he disappeared. He borrowed money and forgot to pay it back. He promised side jobs and lost the keys. He took customers' trucks out for estimates and came back with new dents. Dad covered for him. Mom covered for him. I covered for him when I was too tired to fight anymore. The last time I saw him before he vanished, he had taken the Friday deposit and told Dad he was going to buy parts from a supplier in the next town. He never came back with the parts. He never came back at all. At first, we thought he had gone on one of his usual benders. Then the phone went dead. Then his apartment was empty. Then the banks started calling. Then I found out he had emptied the little emergency account Mom kept hidden in her dresser. The one she claimed was for utilities and groceries in case of disaster. He took that too. I still remember Dad's face when he realized the money was gone. Not anger. Not at first. Just this slow, sinking confusion that made him look older in a single afternoon. He kept saying there had to be a mistake. He kept insisting Caleb would not do that to family. That was the day I learned my father could look straight at betrayal and still call it a misunderstanding. The police treated Caleb like a grown man who had walked away from his life. They said he was allowed to leave. They said if there was no sign of violence, there was not much they could do. My mother cried for weeks. Dad got angry at everyone except the person who caused it. And me, somehow, I became the one they leaned on. I was the one who opened the garage every morning. I was the one who answered creditors. I was the one who explained that, yes, the shop was behind on taxes. I was the one who stayed after closing and figured out how to keep us from losing the building. At the time, I thought I was just surviving. Looking back, I think I was being slowly handed the whole wreckage and told it was mine to save. The part nobody in my family liked to admit was that Caleb leaving forced the truth into daylight. He had been taking money for years, small amounts at first, a few hundred from the register, a charge here and there on the shop card, then bigger sums when Dad was too tired to check the books closely. The books were a disaster by the time I took them over. I found unpaid sales tax, a lien threat from the county, and a parts supplier that was about 3 days away from cutting us off. If I had not been stubborn and desperate, the shop would have shut down within the year. I was 24, exhausted and angry enough to make good decisions. That was the only reason the business survived. I started with the bookkeeping because I could not afford to hire anyone. Then I learned pricing. Then I learned marketing. Then I learned that people loved restoration videos more than they loved polished ads. I posted before and after photos of wrecked classic cars. I posted process clips of sandblasting and paint correction. I posted tiny stories about forgotten vehicles getting a second life. The videos started getting local attention, then regional attention. Then one of them got picked up by an automotive page, and that was when the phone stopped being quiet. Clients wanted the kind of careful work that only happened when somebody loved the details. I loved the details because the details were what kept us alive. The business grew in ugly, practical steps. I negotiated with suppliers. I refinanced debt. I sold my car and bought a used truck for the shop. I worked full-time and took side jobs at night. I slept on the office couch more than I want to admit. Dad hated seeing me do it, but he also never once offered to take the burden back. He was getting sick by then, though he hid it for as long as he could. His hands shook more, his knees hurt, his pride hurt worst of all. When he finally stepped back, he left me in charge because there was no one else left who had actually been showing up. Caleb was gone. Mom was grieving in a way that kept her half present, and I was there. It took 2 years before the shop looked like something worth saving. It took another 2 before it started making real money. By then, I had turned the place into Iron Hollow Restorations because I had to separate the new business from the wreck Caleb left behind. Dad did not like the new name at first. He said it felt cold. I told him cold was cheaper than bankrupt. He did not argue after that. He was proud of me in the way some men are proud when they do not know how to apologize. He talked about me to customers like I was the miracle and not the person who had been patching the same hole in the roof for 3 winters. He never said he was sorry for believing Caleb would eventually come home and fix everything. He never said he was sorry for leaving me to do it alone. I did not expect him to. That was the most exhausting part of growing up in my family. Nobody said the things that actually mattered. They only said the things that kept the damage moving. Then Dad died. That was another pile of things nobody handled well. It was sudden enough to feel unfair and slow enough to hurt. His heart gave out before we could get him through the winter. By then the shop was stable, but the stability did not make grief easier. It just made it quieter. After the funeral, Caleb did not show, no call, no flowers, no note. My mother kept saying he was probably ashamed. I started to suspect shame was one of the few feelings he had never been required to practice. After Dad's death, the estate was simple because there was almost nothing left to split. The house was in Mom's name. The old garage building had already been transferred to me 2 years earlier when Dad realized Caleb was never coming back. The transfer was legal. It was notarized. It was not even dramatic. Dad had just started handing me the keys and the paperwork like a man trying to make peace with a future he did not want. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. For a while, life settled into a pattern that almost felt normal. The shop got a second paint booth. I hired 2 more people. I paid down the last of the debt. Mom moved into a smaller place near my aunt because the old house was too much for her alone. I visited on Sundays. I fixed her car when it needed it. I tried not to talk about Caleb because every conversation about him sounded like a question nobody wanted answered. Then one morning, a local car collector posted a video of one of our restorations. It was a gorgeous, brutal old muscle car that had looked like scrap when it came in and like a dream by the time it rolled out. The video went everywhere. A regional magazine called, then another. Then a television station ran a little feature on the shop and the strange story of the younger sibling who saved a failing family business after the older son disappeared. I hated that story. I smiled through it anyway. It brought in more work than I had ever handled before. It also apparently brought Caleb back. I found that out when the lawyer's card landed on my desk 3 days after the feature aired. I assumed it was a scam at first. Then I called the office number and learned there was, in fact, a firm representing my brother. That was the first revelation that made my stomach drop. The second was when Mom showed up at the shop before the meeting and could not quite meet my eyes. She told me he had reached out to her first. She had seen him in person 2 days earlier. He was not homeless. He was not recovering in a shelter. He was not some broken man who had wandered home with nothing. He had come back put together enough to hire a lawyer. That meant he had money for that. I kept waiting for my mother to mention an apology. She never did. Instead, she kept talking about how hard life had been for him, how people made mistakes, how brothers should not fight over property, how families should stay united. I felt like I was being asked to donate my own body parts for the sake of peace. I told her the building and business were mine. I told her Caleb had disappeared with cash, tools, and years of unpaid debt. I told her he had no claim. She looked at me like I was being cruel. That hurt more than it should have, because I had spent 6 years being the one who made the hard choices, and the second Caleb was back, I was suddenly the unreasonable one for not rewarding him. The meeting with the lawyer was worse than I expected. He had documents claiming Caleb had a continuing equity interest in the business as part of the family arrangement. The claim was vague enough to be insulting and detailed enough to make me realize they had spent time building a story around my life. They had bank statements from before the disappearance. They had old photos of Caleb standing in the garage. They had a copy of the original partnership paperwork from when Dad had briefly tried to involve both sons in the business years earlier. The lawyer kept framing it as a family matter. That was his polite way of saying he wanted me to cave before anyone had to do real work. I did not cave. I asked for proof. They had none. I asked for records showing Caleb had contributed after he left. They had none. I asked why he had not contacted me when the business was collapsing and the debt was growing. The lawyer did not answer that one. Caleb did not like being questioned. He had spent too long in a family that treated him like he was naturally entitled to a softer version of reality. He sat there with folded hands and the same half-smile he used on Dad when he wanted a favor. He looked annoyed. Not guilty. That was when I knew this was not a desperate family reunion. It was a business move, and somebody had told him the business was worth enough to fight over. I told them I needed time to review the documents. The lawyer said that was fine. Caleb acted like he had already won. Mom acted relieved, which made me angry all over again. After they left, I sat in the office and stared at the parts inventory until my vision blurred. Then I did something I should have done years earlier. I started digging. The first thing I found was the money trail. Caleb had not just disappeared. He had been moving. A lot. Small deposits from jobs in 3 different states. Rent payments tied to a storage unit in another county. A history of old utility bills under a name I did not recognize at first because he had used our mother's maiden name. He had been hiding in plain sight, just enough away from the family to avoid responsibility, but close enough to watch us if he wanted. That discovery made my skin crawl. The second thing I found was worse. He had been sending Mom money every few months. Not much. Enough to keep her from panicking. Enough to make her believe he was struggling but surviving. She had known. She had known he was alive and did not tell me. When I asked her why, she cried and said she did not want to lose both sons. That was the moment I understood that my mother was not evil. She was weak in exactly the way that lets damage keep happening. She had been feeding Caleb small amounts of support and hoping the truth would arrange itself into forgiveness. It never does. That money explained why she had defended him so quickly. It also explained why she looked sick every time she saw me in the months after he vanished. She had been hiding him from me. I do not think she fully understood how deeply that betrayal landed. To her, it was survival. To me, it felt like proof that my hard work mattered only until it became inconvenient. I did not tell her everything I found right away. I kept digging. That was the third revelation, and it was the one that changed the shape of the whole story. Caleb had not simply been working odd jobs. He had spent 2 years in another state with a woman who had her own legal troubles. They had broken up. He had a storage unit full of receipts, old parts, and what looked like half a life built on credit he never intended to repay. He had a bankruptcy filing that had gone nowhere because he never completed the process. He also had a misdemeanor theft record that had been sealed in another county. Not serious enough to make headlines, serious enough to explain why he had vanished when he did. I started to see it clearly then. He had not left because he was finding himself. He had left because he was trying to outrun consequences. And when those consequences got too close, he came back to the one place he thought would still carry him. Family. The worst part was that he had timed his return around my success. He did not come home when Dad was dying. He did not come home when Mom was sick. He came home when the shop had value. I found out later that he had seen the television feature and recognized the building from the old sign in the background. He had probably been searching for us before that. Waiting. Watching. Deciding when the business was worth the risk. That knowledge made me feel physically ill. I also learned he had been asking around about the property before he contacted the lawyer. He had spoken to one of Dad's old drinking buddies, a man who had never met a boundary he respected. That man told him the building should have belonged to both sons. He told him the family always expected Caleb to take over. He probably also told him exactly how much the place was worth now. It was the kind of gossip that passes for truth in small towns. That was enough to inflame greed. It was also enough to make Caleb believe he could walk in and take half before anyone checked the paperwork. He was wrong. The shop had been transferred to me legally years earlier. Dad had done that after Caleb disappeared, and after I proved I could keep the doors open. There was no partnership left to revive. There was no hidden inheritance waiting for Caleb. There was only his old name on a few obsolete forms and my very real signature on every bank account, vendor contract, payroll record, tax filing, lease renewal, and insurance policy that mattered. When I understood that, I felt the first real relief I had all week. Then the relief disappeared when I found the ledger box. It was in Dad's old filing cabinet in the back office, wedged behind tax folders and service manuals. I had gone through that cabinet before, but not carefully enough. This time I found a sealed envelope with my name on it in Dad's handwriting. Inside was a notarized transfer of interest from Caleb to Dad, dated 4 months before he disappeared. Along with it was a handwritten statement that Caleb had signed, acknowledging that he had received money from Dad in exchange for surrendering any claim to the garage, the tools, and all future business profits. It was not poetic. It was not dramatic. It was the paper version of a father paying his own son to leave before the whole family got dragged under. I sat there for a long time with the document in my hands. I was angry at Dad. I was angry at Caleb. I was angry at Mom for keeping the existence of the envelope hidden from me after all these years. And underneath all of that, I felt this sick little flicker of understanding. Dad had known Caleb had become dangerous to the business. He had known he was making financial decisions that could destroy us, so he bought him out quietly before Caleb could leave with something more valuable. That was probably supposed to be the end of it. Instead, Caleb took the cash left anyway and let us clean up the wreck. I took copies of every document and sent them to the lawyer. I expected the claim to disappear after that. It did not. Caleb doubled down. He started showing up at the shop in person. He did not make scenes in public. He stood in the lot, waited for customers to leave, and tried to talk to employees about family history. He told them he had built the place with me. He told them he had taught me everything. He told them he only wanted what was fair. It would have been pathetic if it had not been so calculated. One of my employees, a guy named Marcus who had worked with me for 3 years and trusted me more than he trusted himself, came to me looking worried. He had heard Caleb talking to a former supplier in the parking lot. Caleb had apparently been trying to convince people that I was hiding assets from him. That was when I knew this had moved from family pressure to an actual threat. He was not just asking. He was trying to build a story that could hurt the business. I hired a lawyer of my own the next morning. That was another line I had not expected to cross, but once it was crossed, it felt strange how necessary it had always been. My lawyer looked through the transfer papers, the old bankruptcy records, the sealed theft case, the tax history, and the current business filings. Then she told me what I already suspected. Caleb had no legal claim to half the business, not one that would survive a challenge. If he kept pushing, he would risk exposing the old transfer and his own past conduct in the process. That should have scared him off. It did not. Instead, he made one more move that finally gave me the proof I needed. He tried to open a business credit account in my shop's name, not with my permission. Not with my signature. Using information he remembered from childhood and the kind of confidence that only comes from assuming nobody will dare call the police on family. The credit company flagged it because the contact number was old and the application address was wrong. They called me to verify. I nearly dropped the phone. That application told me 2 things at once. First, Caleb was trying to leverage my business for cash behind my back. Second, he had no intention of being a silent partner if he got in. He wanted access. He wanted control. He wanted the money my work had made. The final straw came when I checked one of the storage units tied to his name. I only did that because my lawyer said I should document every connection I could find. Inside, I found boxes of old garage receipts, a pair of shop notebooks that had gone missing years ago, and copies of customer invoices from before he disappeared. Some of those invoices had my handwriting on them. Some had Dad's. Some had Caleb's. But the truly unsettling thing was a folder full of photographs of the shop during the years I was rebuilding it. He had taken them from a distance. Different seasons, different angles, the same lot, the same building, the same truck out front. He had been watching. Maybe not every day, maybe not obsessively in the way a stalker would, but enough to know exactly when the business looked healthy enough to steal. I remember standing in that storage unit and feeling my entire understanding of him shift. I had spent years thinking Caleb was a coward who ran away from family responsibility. That was true, but incomplete. He was also someone who believed time did not count against him if he waited long enough for other people to do the hard work. He had not forgotten us. He had been waiting for us to succeed without him. Then he tried to step in as if his absence had been a strategic pause instead of abandonment. That realization made me colder than anger ever could. I asked my lawyer to put together a response that was clean, factual, and unforgiving. We sent Caleb a formal denial of claim. We included the transfer documents. We included the notarized buyout. We included the application fraud warning. We included enough evidence to make his case look as weak as it truly was. I assumed that would scare him into backing off. Instead, it triggered the family crisis I had been dreading for years. Mom came over the next evening and begged me not to destroy him. She said he had always been the one who needed more help. She said I was the strong one. She said strong people could afford to be generous. I remember looking at her and realizing how often families use the word strong as a polite way to excuse neglect. Being dependable is not the same thing as being disposable. I told her that every time I had been generous, Caleb had treated it like a preview of what he could take later. I told her that if I handed him half now, he would not be grateful. He would be back for more. She started crying harder then. She finally admitted that Caleb had been in trouble long before he vanished. Not just money trouble, theft trouble, debt trouble, a near-arrest trouble. He had hidden how bad it was from everyone except her and Dad had paid him off because he thought a quiet exit would save the family from scandal. That was the fourth revelation, and it hit like a hammer. Caleb had not been a poor lost boy who wandered off in shame. He had been a mess that Dad tried to contain. My mother had known enough to help him disappear. Dad had known enough to buy him out, and I had been the idiot left holding the bag because nobody wanted to say the truth out loud. I asked Mom why she still backed him after all that. Her answer was embarrassingly human. She was afraid he would cut her off again. She was afraid that if she chose me too firmly, she would lose the only child who kept coming back when he needed something. That was the kind of grief families like ours produce. We do not always protect the best people. We protect the people who know how to make us feel chosen, even when they are using us. I did not yell at her. I think she expected me to. I was too tired for that. Instead, I told her that I loved her, but I was done paying for her fear. She sat there in my office for a long time after that, looking older than I had ever seen her. Then she left. I thought that might be the end of her part in this. It was not. A week later, she called me from a parking lot 2 towns over and told me she had checked herself through the old envelope one more time after we talked. She had found something I had missed. There was a second page hidden behind the notarized transfer. It was a handwritten note from Dad to Caleb. It said the buyout was the last money Caleb would ever get from the family if he walked away again. It also said in a way that was heartbreakingly plain that if Caleb came back to take the shop after abandoning it, he would not just be disappointing the family. He would be stealing from the only person who stayed. That was the 5th revelation. Dad had seen it. Maybe not every detail, but enough. He had known exactly what kind of man Caleb was becoming. He had also known exactly what kind of daughter he had in me, and still he never told me. I think he thought he was protecting me from a fight that was coming anyway. Instead, he left me to discover it by inches, one betrayal at a time. The note changed something in me, not my anger. That part stayed. But it changed the way I saw the old garage. It was no longer just the place where my brother had left us. It was the place where my father had quietly chosen to trust me with the future, even while he was still making excuses for the son who was destroying the past. I wish I could say that made me feel better. It did not. It just made me understand that the family I had been trying to save had always been more fragile and more dishonest than I wanted to admit. By then, Caleb was getting desperate. He started contacting old family friends. He tried to recruit cousins. He tried to make my business seem like stolen family property. He even reached out to one of our suppliers with a story about being cheated out of his rightful share. Unfortunately for him, small businesses talk. People compared notes. The more he talked, the more his story fell apart. The supplier who called me was furious because Caleb had tried to imply that I was hiding money and skimming profits. That was laughable to anyone who had watched me keep the business alive through the worst years. I spent too many evenings counting pennies to steal anything from anyone. My lawyer sent him a final notice. The notice gave him 2 choices. He could drop the claim and leave the business alone, or I could take the fraud attempt, the false application, the sealed theft record, and the old buyout paperwork to court. For a while, I thought he might finally back down. Then he did something so unbelievably Caleb that I almost laughed. He showed up at my house instead of the shop. He came with Mom already inside. She had let him in. I got home to find both of them in my kitchen, as if my private life was just another room in the family property. I did not let him stay long. I did not have to. He had the nerve to act offended that I treated the visit like an intrusion. That was when I realized his sense of ownership over me was just as strong as his sense of ownership over the business. He had spent his whole life believing that being older and being blood made him entitled to some permanent share of everyone else's labor. I had spent my whole life confusing that entitlement with personality. The difference mattered, a lot. I told him that the business was mine. I told him Dad had paid him out. I told him he had disappeared. I told him the only thing he had earned by coming back was scrutiny. He kept trying to reframe it as a misunderstanding. He kept trying to act like we could work something out. He kept pointing at family photographs, old memories, shared history. It was infuriating how carefully he tried to manipulate the room without ever actually saying he was sorry. He never apologized for leaving. He never apologized for the money. He never apologized for letting me and Mom and Dad carry the wreckage. He only wanted the reward for surviving long enough to return. That night after he left, Mom finally broke. She told me she had not seen him in person for years before the return. She had only spoken to him by phone and through money transfers. She had told herself it was harmless because he sounded ashamed. That was not harmless. That was a second hidden life. I do not think she understood how much that hurt me until I stopped speaking for a minute and let the silence do it for me. Then she admitted one more thing. Caleb had asked about the business months before the television feature aired. He had somehow known I was growing it. He had known my name was attached to it. He had known it would be worth something if he waited. That was when the final shape of his plan came into focus. He had not returned because he missed his family. He had returned because he had been tracking my success long before I knew he was looking. That realization made the whole thing feel dirty in a new way. It was not just greed. It was patience. Patient greed is somehow uglier than desperation because it has time to grow teeth. I had one more thing to do before this could be over. I pulled the old storage invoices and called the county clerk. The sealed theft case from another county had never been about a random convenience store like I had assumed. It involved shop equipment from a garage where Caleb had been working under a different name after he left us. He had gotten caught moving parts that did not belong to him. The case had been sealed because he paid restitution and agreed to disappear. That was the sixth revelation, and it was the one that made me feel almost physically sick. He had not merely run from family pain. He had run from a crime. The family story had always been that he needed space. The truth was that he needed distance between himself and consequences. Suddenly, every excuse he had ever made sounded different. Every missing tool, every late payment, every borrowed cash advance, every casual lie, it had all been practice. He was a person who knew exactly how far he could push until somebody forced him to stop. My lawyer said we now had more than enough to bury his claim. We also had enough to refer the fraud attempt to the police if we wanted to. I wanted to. Mom begged me not to. She said it would destroy him. I told her he had already done most of that himself. The thing about this kind of family conflict is that it does not end cleanly just because you are right. It gets messy in layers. When I refused to hand over the business, Caleb stopped speaking to me and started telling everyone I had poisoned Mom against him. When I refused to entertain the claim, Mom felt torn and guilty and kept trying to be the bridge. When I refused to pretend this was about hurt feelings instead of property and fraud, the family started splitting into camps. Aunt Denise said I was being harsh. My cousin Nora said I had been more than patient. Two old friends of Dad's told me privately that they had expected Caleb to come back with an angle. No one was surprised except the people who wanted to be. I did not sleep much that month. I kept expecting another move from him. Instead, he kept retreating. His lawyer stopped returning calls after mine sent the full transfer documents. The credit company rejected the fraudulent application. The storage unit auction notice arrived because he had not paid the fees. And then finally, I got the thing I had not realized I still wanted. A real apology, not from Caleb, from Mom. It was not dramatic. It was not enough, but it was real. She admitted that she had enabled him because it was easier than facing the possibility that her oldest child had become a stranger. She admitted that she had let me shoulder more than my share because I was easier to rely on. She admitted that she had mistaken my competence for immunity. That one landed hard because it was true. When people know you will keep going, they often stop checking whether you should have to. I told her I forgave her, but I was not forgetting. That was the healthiest sentence I had ever said to her. It felt like ripping off a bandage I had been wearing for years. For a short while, I thought maybe that was the end of the worst of it. Then Caleb made one last pathetic attempt to save face. He sent a message through a mutual acquaintance saying he only wanted a fair split and that I was turning the family against him. The acquaintance forwarded it to me because apparently even our extended family had reached its limit. Attached to that message was a photo Caleb had posted online. It showed him standing outside the old garage with a caption about blood and legacy. It was meant to look like strength. It looked like trespassing. That post cost him more than he realized. Several customers saw it. They recognized the building. They asked questions. One of them happened to know a retired attorney who had once handled small business disputes. That attorney reviewed the situation and volunteered to help me prepare a cease and desist letter with actual teeth. Once that letter went out, Caleb finally started feeling consequences in real time. He could no longer walk the lot. He could no longer talk to clients. He could no longer pretend the business was a family asset waiting to be redistributed. The last time he tried to come onto the property, Marcus called the police. I did not go outside. I watched from the office window and saw him arguing with the officer like he could talk his way out of a boundary the same way he had talked his way out of everything else. He could not. He left. That should have felt satisfying. In a small way, it did. But mostly it just felt sad. I had spent so many years imagining a final confrontation that by the time it came, I was too tired to enjoy it. A few days later, I got the final legal notice. Caleb had withdrawn every claim. No settlement, no quiet buyout, no shared ownership, just retreat. My lawyer said the withdrawal was smart because he would have lost badly if we had gone to court. I believed her. I also knew he had never intended to win fairly. He only needed enough intimidation to make me give him something for free. That tactic had worked on our family for years. It did not work on me anymore. After everything settled, I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. The business was safe. The records were clean. The building was mine. The debt was gone. The drama should have ended there. But family stories do not end when the paperwork does. They end when people decide who they are willing to be. Caleb did not become a better person because he lost the claim. He drifted back out of town after that, only leaving enough traces for rumor to keep him alive in the gossip chain. Mom stopped sending him money. I know because I asked her to show me the transfers. There were none after the final notice. That was the first honest thing she had done in a long time. She and I are better now, but not healed in some magical way. We are careful. We are blunt when we need to be. She no longer tries to make me responsible for Caleb's choices. I no longer pretend her guilt does not have a price. Dad's name still sits in the shop in small places, on a tool chest, on an old photo, on the framed certificate from when he first opened the garage. I kept those things because I wanted proof that the place had once been more than a battlefield. I did not keep Caleb's pictures. I threw those away, not because I hate him, although some days I come close, but because I am done storing evidence of people who only remember me when I am useful. The last twist came about 3 months later. An investigator from the county contacted me about the sealed theft case because Caleb had used the wrong name in a recent financial filing. That filing connected him to another shop in another state that had shut down under suspicious circumstances. It turned out he had been doing the same thing elsewhere, borrowing from family, touching business money, leaving when the pressure started, moving on before the truth caught him. He was not unlucky. He was repetitive. That was the final thing that changed how I understood the whole mess. I had spent years thinking I was dealing with one bad return. I was actually dealing with a pattern. The disappearing brother, the failed projects, the borrowed money, the false claims, the guilt trips, it all fit. I did not chase him after that. The business did not need me to become obsessed with his downfall. It needed me to keep it strong enough that nobody could ever use his absence against me again. So I did. I expanded the restoration side of the shop. I added a service bay for modern electrical diagnostics. I hired a receptionist so I would stop doing 3 jobs at once. I opened a second small location with one of the old customers who had become a reliable partner. I invested in better equipment. I started taking weekends off sometimes. That last one still feels illegal. There are days when I walk through the shop and think about how close I came to losing everything because the people who should have protected me were too busy protecting the wrong person. There are days when I look at the notarized transfer in my file cabinet and think about how my father tried to solve a problem he was too ashamed to name out loud. There are days when I think about Caleb standing in my office with all that confidence and no right. And there are days when I am honestly grateful he came back because he forced the truth into the open. If he had stayed gone forever, I might have kept carrying this strange, invisible guilt, as if his disappearance had been a hole I was supposed to fill with my own life. Instead, he came back and proved what I had been too loyal to admit. He did not leave behind a brother-shaped hole. He left behind a wound, and wounds do not deserve half of anything. The last thing I heard about him was that he moved again after the county notice and took a job far enough away that nobody local would recognize him right away. Good. I hope he keeps moving, not because I want revenge anymore, because I want distance. I want a life where my success belongs to the hours I worked for it and not to the family member who thinks blood is a business model. Mom asks sometimes whether I think Caleb will ever really understand what he did. I tell her maybe. Then I tell her that understanding is not the same as repair. That usually ends the conversation. My shop is mine. My name is mine. My work is mine. And the first time Caleb tried to take half of it because we were blood, I finally learned something that should have been obvious years ago. Blood can explain where you came from. It does not entitle anyone to what you built after they walked away.